This tutorial covers using the theta-client software with a Flutter Android application. We built the application from a completely blank editor to make the basic principles easier to understand. The steps to build the theta-client Flutter application for Android will be shown for Windows. So for the first step, you build theta-client. Then on Windows, you have to manually copy this AAR, Android Archive file, into a subfolder on theta-client called Flutter Android AAR. At this point, we can create a new Flutter project. And to access the library, we're actually going to manually copy the library into the Flutter project into the subfolder packages. Then we'll adjust the configuration of the pubspec.yaml to access the plugin. Finally, in the build.gradle file of app source, we'll adjust the minimum SDK version and the dependency. I'll first review the steps here in the slides, and I'll walk you through it in the code step by step. So when you're building a new Flutter project, you set up the path for the library, the theta-client Flutter library, with this path : .packages theta-client Flutter. So this is the build for the pubspec.yaml. In the app build.gradle file, you specify the dependency of where this AAR, theta-client debug AAR file is, using the path. So it's two directories up, and then in packages theta-client, because we just copied this thing over in the previous step. Also, we're going to set the minimum SDK to 26. So I'm going to go to the theta-client repository here, and I'm going to clone it down. So I'll do git clone, and I'll paste in the URL. Now I have theta-client installed here. In my Android home, I do have the Android SDK installed and specified in the environmental variables. So I'll first build it, Gradle W. Okay, the client has been built. There's no errors. I've just completed in the README this step, and in our slide deck here, it's this first step here that I've completed, which is to build the theta-client. Now I'm going to copy the library into theta-client Flutter Android AAR. So I'm already in theta-client, so I'll do copy, Kotlin multi-platform, build, outputs, AR, and I'll go star.AR, whoops. Star.AR, and I'll copy it into Flutter Android, Android and AAR folder. So at this stage, I've built theta-client. I just went up one directory. I'm going to create a brand new Flutter project. So Flutter create platforms equals Android. I'll go a Kotlin, and I'll specify the name of my tutorial. I think I'll call Theta Tutorial. And we'll build our new Flutter application. So I'll change directories into Theta Tutorial. I'm going to start VS Code. And on the root of the project here, I'll create packages. And then in the theta-client folder that I just created in the previous step. One of these folders is Flutter. So I'm going to copy everything in here. And in packages, I'm going to create a new subfolder called theta_client_Flutter. And I will paste everything in here. So in the theta_client_Flutter, I now have all the contents of that previous, when we did the build of Theta Client. So we've just finished step 4 here, which is to copy the contents of Theta Client's Flutter into Theta tutorial packages Theta Client Flutter. And now I'm going to add the plugin to the pubspec.yaml. So here's the overview. We just go Theta Client Flutter and then specify the path. So in the pubspec.yaml, let's look for the dependencies Flutter, and one of them is theta_client_Flutter, and we'll go for the path here, which is packages theta_client_Flutter. I forgot the colon here. All right, so insert the path. Run flutter pub get, and there's no errors now. So we're next going to look into the Android folder of the Flutter root directory app build.gradle. Within build.gradle, increase the minimum SDK number to 26. So look for min SDK version and put in 26. In the same build.gradle file, go down to the dependencies section and add the implementation for the files. There should be implementation space files. There's an error here. It should not be .files. Specify the relative path of the Theta Client library for the Android archive, which is .. / so 2 directories up, packages, Theta Client, Flutter, and then go in there is Android AAR and the name of the file. We're using theta-client-debug.aar. We've now completed all 6 steps. To keep the tutorial simple and to focus in on the primary portion of the code that's related to Theta Client, I'm going to delete almost the entirety of the sample Flutter code that comes when you create Flutter by default. Just leave the main method, and in the main method you will need the run app, and the run app requires a widget. We're going to pass it the material app widget. Material app requires a property home, and we're going to pass that a scaffold. Both material app and scaffold are built into Flutter. The scaffold requires a body. I'm going to use the stateful widget shortcut SDFUL. This will create a template stateful widget for me. I'm going to call the new stateful widget Flutter tutorial. Notice that I have all of the Flutter tutorial portions are being updated. Now for the body, I can now pass it the instantiated Flutter tutorial widget. At this point, I realize I have a typo and I put a dot instead of a space for implementation files. This is back in the build.gradle section. Test the app, make sure it runs. Then we're going to import the Theta Client Flutter package that we have locally in the root of our folder in the packages subdirectory. With the package importer, we can now instantiate an instance of theta-client Flutter. I'm going to run it again to make sure that the theta-client Flutter package can be instantiated. And it's looking good. The all white screen is what we want. In the debug console, I'm going to filter out. So the exclamation point is do not show DEGL. This is just some graphics on the emulator. We're next going to initialize the Theta application. The Theta client Flutter has an initialize function which we're going to use in the init state. The init state is built into Flutter, as you know. So within here, we're going to run a new method that we create to initiate or initialize the Theta client Flutter. It's async IO, so it's going to be a future, and it's not going to return anything. We're just going to call it init Theta app. This is our name that we're making up and calling it. Async for async IO, because we need to wait to make sure this thing has been initialized. There's a demo app which has error checking. This tutorial does not cover error checking to make the code a bit easier to read, but obviously when you actually deploy it, you probably want to implement error checking. So we're just going to start off with our first method for the Theta client Flutter, and that's to get the platform type. In this case, we're running it on Android, and so we should have a debug print statement using our first method for Theta client Flutter, which is get platform version. And then in the init state, we just put the name of the function method that we created. And at this stage, I'm just going to connect my development workstation to the RICOH THETA. So on Windows, I'm connecting the Wi-Fi. The password is just the numerical digits of the camera serial number. Just the numbers is the password. So we're running the app and we're getting the debug Android 12, which is the OS that I'm running for the Android virtual device. Congratulations on running your first method from the Theta client Flutter package. We're going to run our second method with it, which is whether the camera has been initialized with the application or not. In this case, we haven't actually initialized the application with the camera, so we should get a false message when we check to see whether it has been initialized. That means you can't yet send the API commands. So we'll first hopefully get a false or a negative. Await Theta client Flutter dot is initialized, so we should get a Boolean variable. And hopefully when we run it, it will be false because that's what we're expecting. So let's run it. I'll do a hot restart. And application starting. And I forgot to include this thing in the value. So let's put a $sign in front of it and try it again. Okay, initialize is false, which is perfect, exactly what we want. So the next line is to initialize it. If you don't pass it any parameters, it's going to take the default endpoint of the RICOH THETA in access point mode, which is 192.168.1.1. And boom, suddenly we have the camera connection. We're getting some information in the debug console from the camera. We have just a ton of information that we can get. We don't need to parse it out because we'll get this information from the client library next. I'm going to divide this demo application or sample application for the tutorial into two sections. I'm going to have a response window at the bottom and some simple buttons at the top. So I'm creating a new widget called response window. Initially, I'm going to have the response window just be a simple piece of text that designates it as the response area. In our rudimentary GUI, I'm going to change the container to a column, I'm going to divide the column into two sections using the expanded widget. So the top portion of the column will be the buttons. So the column has a set of children, and I'm going to use the expanded widget of Flutter, which is it'll be expanded to different screen sizes, and the expanded has a child. I'm just going to put a text that says button area for now, and there's a flex parameter to it, which I'll make the top portion with the buttons a bit bigger than the bottom portion. I'll use a flex of 2 for the top and a flex of 1 for the bottom, which will mean that the top will be twice as big as the bottom, the top portion being the portion with the buttons. So once I've completed the first expanded widget, I'm going to create the expanded widget on the bottom. And I'll put a piece of text there for the response window widget. The response window is the widget that we created. We just created it, and we've assigned it to a piece of text right now that says response window. And this bottom portion will have a flex of 1. So if you run the app, you can see our rudimentary GUI here. I'm going to insert an app bar into the scaffold just for the aesthetics purposes, so that we have that top portion that's being taken care of by Flutter. I'll just put a title of Theta Flutter Demo. I'm going to delete the const in front of the material app. Then I'll run it again. And we now have a nice app bar, and the button area is nicely below the top of the app bar. Let's continue building our GUI. So we're going to replace the piece of text as a placeholder with a text button that we can then press on and take an action and utilize the additional APIs from theta-client to take some action on the camera. So we're going to set up to take a picture. We'll initially set it up so that on pressed it's blank. So everything between the curly brackets, we'll add some code in there to actually take the picture in the next step. Now that we have the take picture button constructed, we're going to actually take the picture using the photo capture class, which is from the theta-client library. We're also going to use a photo capture builder from the theta-client library. The question mark indicates that this could be a null variable. Dart has null safety on it. I'm going to create a separate method to initialize the photo capture class. This will be async IO, which will return nothing, so it'll be void, and we'll call it initialize photo capture. There's no input parameters, and we're using the async keyword from Dart so that we can use async IO within the body of the method. And we'll assign the builder to the instantiated instance of theta-client Flutter dot get photo capture builder. To keep the tutorial simple, we're not using error checking. So you could refer to the demo for better examples of error checking. The exclamation point is indicating that the builder is not null. So we're next going to set the photo capture variable to the value that is being returned from the photo capture builder. And now we have the photo capture object ready to go, and we can use this to take pictures. We just have a small error checking here, where if it doesn't instantiate the builder, we'll print an error message. Now that we have the photo capture object set up, we can now simply use a photo capture dot take picture. I'll first print a debug message letting us know that at least the button has been pressed and that we're expecting the picture to be taken. And then here's where we use the photo capture object dot take picture. It's going to pass a file URL to the callback, which we can use to then see the picture. In the simplified GUI that we have a bunch of buttons on the top 2/3 of the screen, and we have a response window on the bottom. We're going to use a set state because we're using the stateful widgets and just set state to handle the state of this application. We're going to set the response window to an image. It's a widget, right? So it can be a text or it can be any type of widget. And the widget that we're using is the image.network, which is going to take the image URL and display the image. We're using a question mark type equal thumb as a query parameter for the RICOH THETA camera so that we just get the smaller thumbnail image over into our mobile app for this quick preview. There are two different ways to get the thumbnail from the camera. This query parameter type equal thumb is one of them. You can also get the thumbnails from list files from the RICOH THETA API. So in the Flutter init state method that's built in, we're going to then initialize the initialize photo capture, which is we created it in an earlier step, and that will run the initialization of the photo capture object from the RICOH THETA theta-client package. Now we have a simple text button here, and if we press it, there's some action happening. Eventually the picture is taken, it's processed, and it's moved from the RICOH THETA camera over to the app. Maybe just to make the demo in this tutorial just a little bit more realistic, I'll change the text button to an icon button. I'm just going to use the built-in material icons that's built into Flutter. And so I'll pick one that's like a kind of a camera icon. You can, of course, change it to a specific shutter icon, but I think just to make it quick here, I'll just use the built-in material icons without using a separate icon package here. And using the VS Code extension, you can actually see the little icon in the left-hand gutter rail there of VS Code. I'm going to increase the size of the icon to, I'll first try 32. And let's look at it. It looks still a little small, so I think I'm going to increase it to 64. And we'll see what it looks like on this Android emulator, which is a Pixel 4a screen size. So I'll just probably go with this for this demo, 64 pixel size for the icon. I'm going to wrap the icon button with a column so that there can be multiple rows of buttons. And so you can either use that light bulb on the left-hand side in VS Code, or if you do a control dot, there's options will pop open for you to select wrap with column. But now I have the icon button in a column here, and I'm going to attempt to center it, but I think this one won't work properly. The next set of buttons will be info and state. I'll just create some text buttons below the first row of buttons, which will be just the shutter button. And this is a good example of the theta-client library. It makes it much easier to extract data from the info and state commands of the camera. So you can see the camera, for example, the serial number, the firmware version, whether it's been charging, or how much charge the battery has. We'll first just create a blank button that is ready to be pressed so we get the layout correct. We're just using text buttons here, and we'll call it info. and it's a little small, so we'll increase the size and attempt to center it using the Flutter row. Just select main axis alignment as spaced evenly, and it'll center it when there's one button, but if there's more than one element in the row, it'll space it evenly so that there'll be two buttons that's spaced kind of in the center, and there'll be some space between the two different buttons. So that's what that main axis alignment.space evenly does. And to make it a little easier to see in the video, I'll increase the font size to 32 on that button. So we have a pretty humongous info button now. So it's in the guts of the info button here, between the left and right curly brackets. We'll start building up the button. This is async IO. So we'll first go var theta info, which will store the results of the get info command. So the syntax is await, then you have the instantiated version of theta-client Flutter dot get info. That's like the main method. So that dot get info is from the library. Then we're holding the results of that dot get info in this variable we created theta info within set state. So set state is specific to Flutter, and we're using that to change the bottom response window. In the previous example, the bottom response window is an image. We're now making the bottom response window a text widget, and the text widget requires a string property for it to populate. So we'll go firmware. So everything between the single quotes is a string, right? And then $ and the curly brackets is string interpolation in Dart. We're doing theta info dot firmware. So theta info is the main variable holding the info. So we'll first press the info button, and it seems to work great, where we have the firmware version of the RICOH THETA X. Without the library, you have to create your own little parser method, and so this having a library here just saves you quite a bit of time. You don't have to read in the results of info and then parse out the relevant pieces of information. So they don't have all the information in the library, but they have the key ones. So you might want the serial number if your application maybe you might want to store it for the Wi-Fi, for example, or the serial number can also be used to check the model, or maybe to check for unique devices. So firmware version, obviously, you probably want to know to make sure your app works with the camera. And the serial number is also pretty useful, and they're both working right now. In our simple GUI here, the bottom portion in the response window, the text here is a little small. So I'm going to use the Flutter styling to increase the font size. Syntax for a text widget is style, and then you have the text style class from Flutter, the font size property, and then the number, the double number is how big the font is. So I'll increase it to 20, and we'll check it out, see what it looks like. Let's give it a go. Pressed info. Font size looks a little bit bigger and more readable for this demonstration. I'm going to increase the ability to scroll through the text widget by wrapping it within a single child scroll view, just in case we want to have more results in the bottom portion of the window than can fit onto the screen size on different mobile devices. So the single child scroll wheel will allow the bottom portion to scroll if you have a lot more information that you want to check on or present to the user. Let's explore a few more properties from Theta Info. The first is uptime. How long has the camera been up? This might be useful to see how stable the camera or the application is, and maybe you might want to reset it or restart the camera at certain times. You can at least check to see how long it's been up for. And some other properties we have within Theta Info are the the gyro and the GPS. We'll next check to see if the images that you take at the video will have the GPS information on it or not. The video GPS information for certain models is only at the start of the video. And we'll also check to see if the gyroscope is enabled or not. So let's test it out. It's looking good. I forgot to put a new line character. That's the \n after the first string gyro enabled. So I'll go back and I'll put a \n here, and then we will see how the new format looks in our app here. So it's looking good right now. Referring to the theta-client documentation for Flutter, I'm going to use the getState method. The state is useful to grab things like the battery level or the state of the camera. So I'm going to copy the existing info button and paste it back in right next to it on that same row. Then I'll change the label of the new button to state, and we're going to have to change the method, and the properties that we're pulling from the method will be a bit different, right? So we'll first change it to get theta state, and I know that from the API documentation of theta client. And then I control click on it. I'm going to check out to see what's here. So go back into the button, and we'll first hold it as theta state, and then for each of the properties we'll go through it, and I'll just use auto completion to see what is available. And I can see the battery level here, which I'll change. And we'll just start testing it out here. I'm going to comment out the rest of the information from info. I need a comma there. I'll run it again. And I'm grabbing the state. Oh, my battery is at 89% or roughly 90%. So uncomment the next line, and I'll change the variable from theta info to theta state. I'll delete the property. I'll use the dot to see what else is available. Maybe the latest file URL is always very useful. And in Dart, you can put, you can concatenate the strings without a plus sign if you just have these two quotes, like single quotes, and then right below that you have another single quote. So I don't need a plus sign to add the strings together. But we'll check out the charging state. And maybe the recordable time. We'll hot restart the app. And we're pulling all the data from the state. We could, of course, use this in our program to change how the application is reacting based on, for example, the battery level, right? You can just change the icon to make to show the battery level state on your application. So I encourage you to give the theta-client library a look. It's pretty convenient because they did a lot of the heavy lifting for us here, and we can just focus on the GUI and experiment with different types of applications for the RICOH THETA product line. If you have any problems or questions, or you build something, drop us a note in the community.theta360.guide forum.